Bratislava is one of those European capitals that can seem very quiet at first. Most tourists come here just as a day trip from Vienna. They walk around the historic center, see the castle, have lunch, and then pretty much leave and go back to Vienna. But if you actually take time to understand Bratislava, then that's when you really discover a city that has been shaped by so many different empires, fascism, communism, religion, war, and constantly shifting borders of Eastern Europe. And today, it's the capital of Slovakia, and actually one of the most interesting cities in Central Europe. So, Bratislava sits directly on the Danube, and that river has been absolutely fundamental to the city's development. From Bratislava Castle, you will see not only Slovakia, but you can actually see Austria and Hungary as well, and that geography tells you a lot about Bratislava. This is a city that has always existed at the crossroads of Europe. For centuries, this area was part of the Kingdom of Hungary. In fact, Bratislava itself was once the capital of Hungary. Then came Czechoslovakia. Prague became the capital of the new country when Bratislava became the political center of Slovakia, and eventually Czechoslovakia, as we know, disappeared. Today, Slovakia is independent with 5.5 million people, with roughly 500,000 living here in Bratislava. And despite being relatively small, Slovakia has experienced an incredible number of political changes in the last century alone. Empire, democracy, fascism, communism, and finally, the modern Slovak Republic that we know as today. The location of Bratislava has sometimes even been joked about as being the world's most awkwardly located capital because the city itself literally borders two other countries. But, in a day like today, especially with Slovakia having close ties with Hungary and Austria, that's hardly a disadvantage. With the European Union and Schengen zone crossing into Austria and Hungary from Slovakia, it's incredibly easy, and that proximity has actually always influenced the city. Bratislava is so close to the Czech world that in some cases, people may actually find Czech easier to understand than the Slovak dialects from Far East Slovakia, the parts that border the Ukraine. But to understand Bratislava, you have to understand 20th century history. One of the most important turning points came with the Munich Agreement in 1938. Czechoslovakia was forced to surrender to Sudetenland to Nazi Germany. The justification from Hitler was that he was protecting ethnic Germans living in that territory. There were a lot back then. And less than a year later, Germany invaded the rest of the Czechs' land. The comparison to modern political arguments about Russia and Ukraine is sometimes made by historians and commentators because similar arguments about protecting ethnic populations have been used to justify territorial expansion, as in the case of Slovakia in the 1930s. I'm not here to say situations are identical because they're nowhere even close to identical. Slovakia has such a different and dramatic history. In 1939, Slovakia became a nominal independent state that was effectively a satellite of Nazi Germany. Its leader was Josef Tiso, a Catholic priest who became the country's authoritarian president. And that's actually where Bratislava's history became pretty dark pretty quickly. So, before World War II, Bratislava had a large Jewish population. At one point, Jews made up a substantial portion of the city's population. There was a major Jewish district here, and in 1913, actually a huge fire unfortunately destroyed most of it. The fire was accidental. It was not an anti-Semitic attack. An Orthodox Jewish community later established a synagogue here afterwards, and the building is still standing more than a century later. Today, however, Bratislava's Jewish population is tiny, almost non-existent. There aren't even regular services here anymore, and the synagogue is used by a very, very small community. But the history of Slovak Jews during World War II is horrifying. The Slovak government passed many anti-Semitic laws that stripped Jews of their rights and isolated them from society as a whole. They faced restrictions on employment, transportation, education, communication, and everyday life. Remember, not all of this was from Nazi Germany. Some of it was the Slovakian government doing it on themselves. And Slovakia became one of the countries that deported its own Jewish citizens to Nazi concentration and extermination camps. In 1942 and 1943, transports left Slovakia carrying thousands of people Some of the earliest transports to Auschwitz include young Slovak men and women. And this is one of the most disturbing aspects of Slovak history. The Holocaust here wasn't simply something imposed from the outside. They were also a collaboration from the Slovak state itself, as I said just a few moments ago. The country operated its own network of detention and labor camps, while Slovak authorities participated in the persecution and deportation of Jews. Slovakia even paid Germany for some of the deportations. It's incredibly difficult to have this history for a country that's trying to move forward. And yet, there were also Slovaks who risked their lives to save Jewish people. One example is Aaron Grunhut, who helped save more than 1,000 Jews. One of the routes used by people to try to escape, he was using the Danube. From here, people could travel down the river towards Belgrade, modern-day Serbia, then it was Yugoslavia, and eventually towards the Black Sea and Mediterranean. So once again, the Danube wasn't just a geographic feature, actually it was like a route of survival. And if you walk around Bratislava today, you'll constantly find reminders of how many different powers have controlled the city. There are military buildings that have served completely different regimes over the centuries. Austro-Hungarian forces, fascist forces, communist forces, and eventually the modern Slovak state. Even the Slovak flag carries symbols of complicated history. The double cross represents the country's Christian and historical traditions, and the symbol has been used by very different political movements throughout Slovak history. After World War II, the country entered in a completely different period. So Czechoslovakia was reestablished, but the Soviet influence from the east was growing. Eventually, the communists took control there, and so this is when you really had the full Eastern Bloc that we know it as today. And this wasn't initially the overwhelming victory that you can imagine when the communists took over. In the 1946 election, the Communist Party won the largest share of the vote, but not an outright majority. Soon after, however, the political system was transformed, opposition parties were eliminated or absorbed, and then Czechoslovakia became a communist state. People who were considered political opponents, religious leaders, and other perceived threats to the regime were imprisoned or sent to forced labor. Some were sent to uranium mines, and uranium was extremely important to the Soviet Union because of its role in the nuclear arms race. The mines were notoriously dangerous, much like coal mines, and workers suffered terribly. But there's an interesting generational divide when people talk about communism in Slovakia. Among older Slovaks, opinion about whether life was better under communist Czechoslovakia can be surprisingly divided. For younger generations, the perspective tends to be very different. And that's partly because 1950s and 60s were a complicated period. There actually was significant infrastructure development. Electricity reached rural areas, cities expanded, factories and transportation infrastructure was built. But at the same time, the country was finding it very hard to continue to develop with the rest of the world in other fields of technology. While Americans and Soviets were competing to race to space and eventually the moon, and Japan was developing its famous high-speed rail system, Czechoslovakia was dealing with enormous inefficiencies. One of the most bizarre examples of Bratislava's radio and television infrastructure plan. Construction of the city's famous radio began building in the 1960s, and the project took decades. The building was designed around acoustics, with its unusual shape intended to reduce outside noise. There were acoustic materials throughout the building, including extensive carpeting, but there's another example for why projects could take so long. And many people blamed it on the communist bureaucracy, and Bratislava even had a plan for a metro system, but that was never completed. Then there was the border. During the communist period, the border between Czechoslovakia and the West was heavily guarded. In some places, it functioned almost like a smaller version of the Berlin Wall. There were fences, guards, dogs trained to stop people from escaping. Some of the dogs were bred specifically for border patrol. People died trying to cross the border. And then came 1968. Czechoslovakia had begun experimenting with political reforms in what became known as the Prague Spring. The Soviet Union and other Warsaw Pact countries responded by invading. Tanks entered Czechoslovakia. The reforms were crushed, and the country remained under communist rule for another 2 decades. There are reminders of this period throughout Bratislava. City once had streets and public spaces named after Stalin, Lenin, and other communist leaders, and even children were exposed to military culture. Young children were taught military skills, including exercises with gas masks and even grenades, so that can actually continue through decades. Eventually, though, communism collapsed. Czechoslovakia transitioned peacefully away from communist rule, and then in 1993, the country itself peacefully split into two independent states, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Bratislava became the capital of Slovakia. And today, you can see the country's transformation in the architecture. Walk from Old Town towards the government and business districts, and suddenly the historic buildings give way more to modern offices and more contemporary infrastructure. Feels like a completely different city. And that's one of the things I find most interesting about Bratislava. You can stand in one place and see hundreds of years of history layered on top of each other. The medieval city, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the first Czechoslovakia Republic, the Nazi period, communism, and finally modern Slovakia. And despite all these changes, religion has actually remained a heavy, important part of the Slovak identity. Slovakia has historically been a heavily Christian country, and the church was often one of the institutions communist authorities viewed as a potential threat. Communist governments understood that religious institutions had their own independent communities and influence, so churches were sometimes targeted, restricted, or destroyed. Today, however, Christianity remains a major part of Slovak society, and Slovakia eventually moved firmly towards the west. It joined NATO and the European Union in 2004. Then in 2007, Slovakia joined the Schengen area, and that changed the meaning of Bratislava's geography. For centuries, being next to Austria and Hungary meant being on the frontier between competing powers. However, today it means being just minutes away from other European countries. You can drive across Slovakia from east to west in a matter of hours, but during World War II, it took months for the country to be liberated. That contrast really puts Slovakia's modern transformation into perspective. And perhaps that's the best way to understand Bratislava. This isn't necessarily a city where you need to spend weeks checking off tourist attractions. In fact, most visitors don't. They just go for a day or half day. Around 90% of tourists reportedly come as just day trippers, really from Vienna. And most stay almost the entire time in the historic center. But if you leave those streets behind, you'll start seeing a different Bratislava, a more modern Bratislava, a more ordinary Bratislava. I know, the contrast, right? A Bratislava where people actually live, and that's where you begin to understand Slovakia beyond what you just see on social media. Because the city has spent centuries sitting between larger powers: Hungary, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, now the European Union. Bratislava has constantly had to adapt to whoever was in power, and somehow, through all of this, it's emerged as the capital of a modern European country. Today, Bratislava has excellent transportation, expanding infrastructure, universities, culture, one of the most strategically interesting locations in Europe. For a city that has spent so much of its history caught between powerful neighbors, Bratislava is finally in a position where its location isn't a weakness, it's one of its greatest strengths.